So, oftentimes, whenever we think of the West, we usually think of the story of cowboys and Indians. I know my mom is from a generation that grew up watching old westerns on TV, and it had images of cowboys shooting Indians and Indians fighting with their bows and arrows. And so, kind of related to that, I want you to think about this question. What is the purpose of a mascot? And take a few minutes and tell me or tell yourself, do you strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree with this statement? Mascots depicting natives, braves, Indians, or redskins are offensive. And so, whenever we take a look at the states that have American Indians as mascots, if you take a look at this map, you can actually see that a good portion of the states that have American Indians as mascots actually do not have a high percentage of American Indians. And so, what does that tell you about choosing American Indians as a mascot? And this video here, I will put this video in Blend so you can watch it. And I want you to just think about how this campaign makes you feel. And kind of another topic related to this, there's often a word that is thrown around that is a racial slur. And so in this class, we're going to look at how different groups have been portrayed throughout history. And so this video is going to actually target one particular word that is offensive, and that word is called redskin. And so oftentimes we don't think about how words can hurt people. So once we're done with this lecture, take a few minutes and watch this video in Blend and think about what that word might mean and how we might use that word, or maybe choose not to use that word now. So our big picture question for today is going to be, what impact did Western expansion have on Native Americans, and what role did the U.S. government play? And something I really want to highlight here, because this is going to be a common theme in our class, it's going to be, what role did the U.S. government play? So last class, we looked at the role of the government in influencing and expanding westward, and helping to encourage individuals to move west. And so now we're going to look at, what role did the government play when designing or impacting these American Indians. And so one of the first policies that the government is going to have for Native Americans is that's actually going to be this policy of relocation. They are literally going to force American Indians who are living on the East Coast to march thousands of miles after they basically starve them in holding rooms and holding cages. They are going to force them to march to this area of Oklahoma. This is known as the Trail of Tears. After they forcibly relocate American Indians, they are going to design this special system called the reservation system. And so the reservation system is going to be a system that sets aside small pieces of land that are usually not very fertile and not very desirable for American Indian tribes to live on. And what they're going to do is they're going to force these different tribes to live in these foreign areas that are in the middle of nowhere in undesirable land. And so they are going to force American Indians to change their way of life. And these reservations, they are supposed to be their own sovereign, meaning independent nations or countries. However, they're going to experience a lot of restrictions and a lot of hardships on those reservations. And so again, I want to remind you of the word act. So one of the first laws, so remember, act equals law. Act equals law. One of the first laws that is passed to remove American Indians is the Indian Removal Act. And so this law literally gives the U.S. government permission, like whose permission did they need, right? To force American Indians who are living east of the Mississippi, so that's everywhere over here, they forced them to march to areas of Oklahoma. In addition to this Indian Removal Act, another policy of the United States government to kind of facilitate and help settlers and railroads expand west is going to be the slaughter of the buffalo. And so the United States government is actually going to encourage individuals to go out on trains and slaughter thousands and thousands of buffalo. And so the U.S. Army and the Bureau of Indian Affairs is going to encourage the slaughter of the buffalo for a couple of reasons. One, primarily because it targets the food source of American Indians. And so if you get rid of their food source, what's going to happen to the American Indians? Their culture is going to die off. They're going to die off. Another reason for targeting the buffalo is to make room for the railroads to expand and possibly even make room for the cattle and for the beef industry there. Another policy that the government is going to implement to make westward expansion easier is going to be this policy of assimilation. And so I want you to remember this word, assimilation. Assimilation, assimilation. And if you look within the word, it almost looks like it has that word similar in it. And so assimilation means to absorb any immigrant or culturally distinct group into the prevailing culture. And so in order for Indians to assimilate into white culture, they had to be civilized, meaning that the American government tried to strip them of their native worldviews, customs, and languages. And ways that they did this was by creating these American Indian boarding schools. And so one example, and I'll put this clip in YouTube, or sorry, in Blend as well, was this Carlisle school. And so what they would do is they would literally take families apart. They would take the children into these schools and they would force them to learn English. They would force them to change their names. They would force them to cut their hair. They would force them to totally change and abandon the culture that they had known in order to assimilate them into American culture. And so I want you to try to think of in your head, what is an example of assimilation occurring today? All right, so once more, another attempt by the United States to assimilate American Indians into mainstream American culture is going to be this Dawes Act. And so again, remember, act means law. Act means law. Act means law. And so this Dawes Act at first kind of seems like it would help American Indians. But what it actually does is it says, okay, American Indians, if you give up your way of life, if you decide you want to be a farmer and you want to own land and you want to settle just like a white American and you want to go to school just like us, give up your culture, then you can have citizenship rights. And so this Dawes Act, even though in the American government mind, they're saying, look, we're going to make them citizens and they're going to be happy. It's going to persuade and force American Indians to give up their cultural traditions in exchange for citizenship. And so again, this is the Dawes Act. And it was also a tool and a method to divide up this Indian tribal land and to divide it up, which would also make it easier for railroads, make it easier for white settlers or any other kind of industry that might want to take over an area. And finally, the American Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 is passed. And so again, act means law. Act means law. Act means law. And so if you remember, to be a citizen in the United States, you're supposed to be born here, right? And so all of these American Indians, they were born here. And so it's not until 1924 that the U.S. government is going to formally recognize them as citizens. And something else I want you to think about too is, so this Citizenship Act is supposed to grant citizenship rights. So remember, what amendment gave former slaves citizenship rights? That was the 14th Amendment. So, and that says you can't discriminate based on color. Everybody born here gets equal citizenship rights. Why did we need this law if that amendment was working? A second amendment that also impacted people of color. Remember the 15th Amendment was supposed to guarantee that former slaves, or at least male former slaves, got the right to vote, and that no discrimination could be made based on race or color. Well, again, this law is supposed to guarantee American Indians the right to vote. And so I just want you to think about, how do you think American Indians were treated? Do you think it was similar, or do you think it was different from Black Americans in the South?